Um, Also, we've got our professional programs, events and activities. So please don't forget to contact us if you're interested in any of our fantastic professional programs that have all been designed to fit around your working lives. Things like our Executive MBA, our MSc in Public Leadership, and also our part-time MSc in Human Resource Management. So please do let us know if you're interested in any of those programs. So this webinar is being recorded. Well, it just is now because I forgot to press record at the very beginning. So thanks, team, for pressing record for me. Too many things to remember. So if you'd like to put any questions to Professor Henley or Rob Basini at the FSB, please send them through the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. And yeah, what we're trying to do is if your question selected, your audio will be magically enabled for you to be able to answer your question directly. So please know that if you do put in a question, you might be called upon to directly ask it to our panelists today. We've got hashtags, we've got, you know, we really encourage Twitter interactivity, so please do tweet us about some of your thoughts related to this session. So that's it from me, really. I'd just like to take a few moments to introduce the panelists today. Professor Andy Henley is going to briefly describe the small and micro business landscape in Wales before the onset of the coronavirus crisis, and then he'll present a short overview of some of the emerging evidence of various sources, including his own analysis, on the impact of the crisis on small business. He's then going to look at some of the factors which are helping businesses to recover and rebuild as we start to slowly emerge from lockdown. Following this, and as most of you will know, we have Rob Basini from the Federation of Small Businesses, the UK's largest business support organisation. So big shout out to the FSB. They're a not-for-profit organisation which lobbies on behalf of small businesses and provides an extensive range of member benefits. So the COVID-19 crisis has obviously had a huge impact on small businesses across the country. So it's a really crucial point for so many people, so many businesses. And the FSB is really understanding the essential role that it now must play in discussions around reopening. So we'll hear from the FSB about what they're proposing. So that's it from me, and I'd now like to surrender the Zoom reins to Professor Andy Henley. So over to you, Andy. Thanks.
Okay. How do I share my screen? Right. Great. Hopefully everybody can see that now. Whoops, sorry. Okay, thanks very much, Sarah, for the introduction. I'm just trying to move a few faces off the, that's it, let's put that down there. Right, that's great, I can see what I'm looking at. So thank you very much for the introduction. I wanted to begin this morning just quickly taking you through some of the information, some of the data that's emerging on what's happening to small businesses, and then to offer some broad suggestions about, you know, looking at sort of ideas, some of the success stories out there, and what perhaps we can learn from this in terms of those businesses which are managing to turn around and start to rethink what the future might look like. So first of all, what are the kind of things that prevent SMEs from growing? Well, the kind of list would include things like business capabilities, the opportunities to innovate and invest. Of course, a lot of research suggests that the owner-manager of small businesses themselves are very important, the skills, the leadership and the management practices that they follow. Growth ambition, and particularly the aspirations of small businesses to develop new markets perhaps on an international stage, and of course strategic fit with the external business environment. And if you think about all of those four things, you realize that the COVID-19 pandemic is a kind of perfect storm, because it's impacted just about pretty much every one of those. The business environment has collapsed. The opportunities for trade have become much more challenging. It's been an environment in which businesses have not had either the resources or the inclination necessarily to invest, and that's been a real challenge for business owners and the skills and the experience that they possess. So just very quickly to run through what the landscape looks like in Wales, there you can see that about a third of businesses in Wales, slightly more than the rest of the UK, are micro, just over a third of micro businesses. That's in terms of employment share. So a third of all private sector employment in Wales is taken up by micro businesses, and in total around 60%, just under 60% of all employment in private sector is in small businesses in Wales. And if you look at the sector breakdown by size, you can see that micro businesses, I mean, obviously agriculture is important, but aside from agriculture, we've got the smallest businesses very heavily focused in construction, in some of the service sectors, particularly the other services. But generally speaking, you can see the overall picture there. And finally, one of the things I just want to talk about, and there's been some data just released this morning from the ONS, which is quite worrying on this, but just a reminder, of course, that a lot of business owners are in fact sole traders. There are roughly 200,000 businesses in Wales, and around about 180 odd thousand or something of those are self-employed, sole trader or self-employed owned businesses. And although the proportion of the self-employed is a little bit lower in Wales than it is in the UK as a whole, it's still the case that about 14.5% of all our workforce was self-employed on the eve of the pandemic hitting, which is over 200,000 people in Wales. So, and one final slide, that just illustrates the impact of the lockdown effect on Cardiff. That's from the Centre for Cities, and you can see the total collapse in footfall in Cardiff as people were told to stay at home and did stay at home. So stay at home effectively meant a loss of demand, particularly in essential, except perhaps in essential goods and services, or perhaps where businesses were able to move activity or already had selling activity online, or were in a position to be able to start running home deliveries. Stay at home effectively meant people couldn't go out and engage with those businesses that operate from bricks and mortar, face-to-face type premises. Protect the NHS, well, exemptions for key workers, and of course some government advisors apparently. But that did present some opportunities for businesses, new contracts for various things, building in construction, building emergency hospitals, supplying, repurposing equipment to produce PPE, for example. But the impact of social distancing on workplaces had a significant impact on smaller premises. Smaller premises, much more difficult to adopt the 2 meter social distancing rule simply because of lack of space, and particularly those businesses where it wasn't possible to simply send people home to work, that had a really very significant impact. And knock-on effects, of course, for employee well-being, even if, particularly for those workers who have been sent home and furloughed, but even for those working from home, it can be quite a challenge. But you're not alone. The government introduced a variety of business support schemes at national level, and including in many of these are operating within Wales. Devolved in some cases down to local authority level. The main scheme was the coronavirus job retention scheme, furloughing. 80% of workers, 80% of all SMEs took that scheme up, including 80% in Wales. Government-backed accredited loans or finance schemes, again, around 18% in Wales of businesses took that opportunity up. And business grants funded from the UK or the devolved governments. And here Wales is doing very well, actually. The Economic Resilience Fund, which the first wave of which has closed, but there's a second wave coming in the near future. Actually, 30% of SMEs in Wales have taken up business grants under that scheme, which is a rather higher proportion than the rest of the UK in the equivalent schemes. And for the self-employed, we have the income support scheme, and 73% of the eligible self-employed, I make that point carefully because not all self-employed are eligible, but 102,000 or 73% of the eligible self-employed have taken up that support scheme, and a number of other different schemes in operation providing support with business rates and VAT payment, for example. So let's try and piece together some of the impact of what's going on here. And I've got three particular sources. One is some early work done by the University of Sheffield for Small Business Britain. There's the ONS data themselves, who have been regularly surveying businesses through the crisis, and some more recent work on self-employed, including some of my own analysis on the UK Household Longitudinal Survey. So the first is what is early survey work in late March, showing that really a lot of businesses expected very, very significant impacts. And actually, if anything, the what's been borne out by the data since is that the impact has been, if anything, even more serious than these figures would suggest. Nearly 3/4 of surveyed businesses expected turnover reductions of over a half. How are businesses going to cope with this? Unpaid leave, reduced hours, home working, moving online. In fact, as you saw from the furloughing information, actually probably a much higher proportion than that 29% have actually taken up the opportunities to have their wage costs partly covered by the government. The ONS itself has been running a business impact of coronavirus survey fortnightly from April, and we now have 5 waves available of this. So 1 month into lockdown, this is roughly the end of April, mid to late April, the ONS were finding from their survey work that 27% of SMEs had seen their turnover drop by at least 50%. But the positive news in here is that there was a third of SMEs whose turnover was unaffected or increased. And in fact, a small proportion, 11%, had increased hours, and some had recruited additional staff. So it's not completely bad news. It is pretty grim, but there are clearly out there some businesses that are managing to weather the storm, and in a minority of cases actually make progress. And finally, on the self-employed, a couple of sources. First of all, the London School of Economics have done their own survey a month or so ago. They found that the proportion of the self-employed who are earning less than £1,000 a month doubled to over 60% of the total. So the impact on the self-employed has really been significant, and that's borne out by some further very recently released data from the ESRC's Understanding Society project, which is a huge longitudinal household survey. It's been surveying households for 10 years now. In fact, some of the households in the survey have been in it for nearly 30 years. And I've done some very quick analysis of this data in the last few days. 10% ceased self-employment between January and April this year. And we've just had some data this morning from the ONS, which shows that there's actually been a drop of 130,000 in the numbers of self-employed over this over the year up to April. 48% of the self-employed have seen their earnings fall. And just over a third have seen earnings drop by over 50%. And not surprisingly, perhaps, it's younger, self-employed, female, non-graduates who are more likely to lose earnings. 2/3 have reduced their hours, and the reasons they say they've had to reduce their hours and cut down their business has been the lockdown regs, particularly just not being able to get out there and do business, and the loss of demand that's followed that. But in some cases, a minority of cases, but a significant minority, it's also been due to health concerns and the need to self-isolate. But again, there's positive news in here. 32% are reporting rises in their earnings of over 50% or more in this survey. It's only 1,350 people, but nearly a third are showing a significant improvement during the crisis. So there are people who are clearly found themselves in a position to be able to, suddenly what they were doing, what their business was providing, was actually important. So what about turnaround then? Well, it's a famous phrase that entrepreneurship is all about creative destruction, perennial gale of creative destruction, as Joseph Schumpeter famously said. And there are success stories out there, and from time to time you see these stories showcased in the news on the BBC website, for example. The Development Bank of Wales themselves have also got a few showcase stories to showcase. That's Dylan's restaurant chain up in North Wales. What are the key issues then? Well, and I'm thinking particularly at the small and micro end of the scale. First of all, innovation and business model redesign. We think of innovation as being about, well, building a new widget or you know, inventing something new, but actually most innovation activity by SMEs is new to business process or organizational innovation. It's not about new products or services, it's about doing stuff in a new way or organizing yourself in a new way, not necessarily completely new to the world, but new to the business. And in order to do that, being able to acquire knowledge is important, but a lot of knowledge acquisition is informal, and that points to things like networking and ability to find and you know, glean information about what might work. People are very important. Firms need to retrain, well, they need to retain and retrain, but they need to, their human capital is extremely important, and firms need to, in small firms, as much as any other firm, need to invest in not only the skills of their workers, but I think also it's very important to say the well-being of their workers. And some of the really good examples out there about where firms are thinking, you know, what can we do to actually make sure that our staff, who are very important to us, are actually coping and weathering the crisis and dealing with all the other stuff that's going on in their lives, like having to homeschool their kids and all the rest of it. Management and leadership, well-being is very important for the managers themselves. Psychological resilience, being able to find opportunities to be mentored, opportunities to network, and, you know, discover that you're not in it, unsurprisingly, you're not in this alone. There are lots of other people out there who are facing the same challenges, and sharing good, you know, good practice and knowledge about what works and how to cope with what's going on. Maintenance of financial support for SMEs with a sound business model. Now, actually, in a sense, you know, at least this crisis has happened at a time when interest rates were low. I mean, it's a strange thing to say, perhaps, but you know, it would have been even worse if firms were facing really quite high nominal interest rates. And of course, we already had interest rates that had been historically very low, and they are pretty much zero now, which means that actually for firms that need to find finance and are able to find finance, the costs of doing that are low, and I think they're likely to remain so for some considerable time. And then supply chain resilience and market demand. And it's important to think about the role of anchor companies and ensuring that small firms can remain embedded within their supply chains. Once supply chains start to fragment and break up, then that's when the whole, you know, the economy starts to collapse. The whole supply side of different sectors starts to crumble, and we're in real trouble. And of course, finally, it's important to say that we do need a supportive macroeconomic and public spending environment. At the moment, you know, there's a lovely cartoon in one of the papers this morning of somebody going to the till with a TV set because the shops opened in England yesterday, and the caption underneath was, "I thought Rishi Sunak was paying for everything." Well, it almost seems like that at the moment. But I think the important point to say is that we really must not, or we don't need a return to kind of the austerity that we saw after the financial crisis, because over the sort of medium term, 2, 3, 4 years out, that would be extremely bad indeed if suddenly there's going to be a kind of, you know, a government that's unwilling to continue to finance this through expansionary fiscal policy and wants to then start to increase taxes or really screw down even further on public spending. And there's a number of other stuff that government needs to be doing to make sure that the environment is okay. And I'm going to, at that point, shut up and hand over to Rob, because I know that's what he particularly wants to talk about.
Thanks very much, Andy. Over to you, Rob.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Some really interesting and from our point of view, absolutely valid points that you've made there. And it's great to see that some of our own research kind of matches some of the things that you talked about as well. Morning, everybody, as well. I hope it's okay if I keep my session quite informal this morning. My colleague, Dr. Clear Gareth, was supposed to be doing the session this morning. Unfortunately, he's unable to at the last minute. So I'm covering some of the content that Clear would cover. It's not too heavy in terms of content, so it should be not too painful to listen to me talk for 10 minutes or so. I hope that's going to be okay. What I'd like to do is to run through 2 key documents which we've produced just recently. The first of them is Reopening Wales, which highlights some key areas and issues that need to be addressed for small businesses to reopen effectively and to play their part in recovery. And the second document that I'd like to highlight then is Open for Business. It's all about repurposing public spaces for economic recovery. So if it's okay if I just run through the key points that we've highlighted in those documents. So first of all, in terms of this Reopening Wales document that we've produced, which is highlighting the key areas and issues which need to be addressed generally, social distancing obviously is a key area which needs to be addressed. Currently, there's the 2 metre rule in place. There's lots on the news at the moment about what might change with that. Will we come to 1.5 metres, 1 metre? But some clear guidance, practical and specific guidance from Welsh Government is absolutely crucial for this. Best practice needs to be highlighted. Retraining of staff, rotating staff, remote working. These are all things within this area of guidance around social distancing, which need to be absolutely clear. Businesses need to know what they're looking to achieve, what needs to happen for effective social distancing. We also think that there should be a social distancing grant or fund to help some businesses who need to make adaptations. Some businesses, by physical layout, social distancing works quite well. I was talking to 2 fish and chip shops just recently, and for one of them, it's almost designed for a beautiful flow of people with a 2 metre gap in a one-way direction. The other fish and chip shop I was talking to, social distancing is a disaster there. So in the one case, it's really difficult for them to implement social distancing. So some sort of funding support would be really helpful. Andy, you mentioned how 60% of private sector employment it comes from the SME sector in Wales. And one of the other reasons for highlighting the need for support is that these smaller businesses tend to have less cash available to actually invest. I drove past many bigger businesses on the weekend who are open, and they've got cash to throw at social distancing. Many smaller businesses who play this crucial role in employment that Andy touched on don't have that cash available. So the funding element is really crucial to social distancing. There should be some further support for certain sectors. Retail, hospitality and leisure, obviously lots of publicity, rightly so, about how difficult it's going to be for those to reopen potentially, and particularly tourism is going to be particularly hit. So we do think that extending existing development bank support would be great for tourism. And further support should be considered for some of those certain sectors which are going to be worst hit. In terms of refocusing funding generally, there was the £90 million Transforming Towns Fund, which was announced probably a year ago now, maybe something like that. But we think that should be refocused to reshape towns for recovery. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about public spaces and towns later on. But refocusing that 90 million would certainly play a part in helping recovery. Cybersecurity is another area which is becoming more of a risk as more business is being done online, as some dodgy groups are getting more switched on to opportunities because more business is being done online, because businesses are dabbling with online sales and maybe they haven't done that before. The risks to businesses are actually much higher than they've been up until now at this point in time. So some sort of cybersecurity campaign with possibly involvement from police and crime commissioners would be certainly helpful. Clear guidance around HR, employment practices, reinduction to new practices, health and safety. Andy, again, you touched on well-being. Well-being not only is I think most of us would like to think is the right thing to do for staff, it also comes with real economic benefit. If we look after staff, there's some serious economic benefit to businesses. So clear HR guidance would be key as well, and whether that's going to be provided through Welsh Government guidance or a mix of public and private provision, the guidance is absolutely got to be there and in place and clear. Andy, again, you touched on leadership and management, and strong management is more essential than ever again, and appropriate training needs to be in place. You touched on innovation, Andy, and the role of innovation at this point in time. Again, just in terms of attitudes to innovation, strong management needs to be creative in terms of thinking of opportunities to innovate. And as you quite rightly said, it's not all about people in lab coats in a laboratory somewhere. Innovation, good innovation sometimes is the simplest thing. It's moving a chair in a premises, or it's changing a bit of layout. So it's improving working practices. So leadership, management, with a focus on innovation is something that we also would really like to see. Late payments has been a huge issue for many businesses, small businesses particularly, for a long time. And the impact now is greater than ever again. When businesses are being squeezed, there's lower footfall, costs are going up in terms of cleaning, new staff to enable new processes. Costs are going up, income potentially is coming down. So the impact of late payments is worse than ever right now. So there needs to be a real focus on addressing late payments. Public bodies can play their part. Best practice can be shared. So Wrexham, Glyndŵr University pay people on a weekly basis right now. That's a model which we think could be replicated for other organisations. In terms of funding generally, Andy, you touched on, I think the phrase you used was a supportive macroeconomic public spending environment. And we'd absolutely go along with that. Another call that we've made in our Reopening Wales document is that the Secretary of State should relax Welsh Government borrowing limits. A report by Cardiff University actually suggests that Welsh Government has limited capacity to borrow, despite disproportionately greater economic challenges than the rest of the UK. With the impact of COVID-19, those challenges are even more acute, and support needs to be properly funded. So we'd absolutely go along, Andy, with your suggestion of a supportive macroeconomic public spending environment. And lastly, in terms of our Reopening Wales document, there still needs to be clarity on what's going to happen with the Shared Prosperity Fund. Because as yet, there still isn't a real clarity on how much money is going to be available, what that's going to be used for, and so on. So I do hope that gives a flavour of some of the key things that we talk about in our Reopening Wales document. There's the social distancing, further support for certain sectors, refocusing of funding that's been allocated for town centres, cybersecurity, clear HR guidance and leadership and management, addressing late payments, and relaxing limits about borrowing. So I hope that gives a flavour of what's in that document. Sarah, can I suggest actually that we circulate these two documents after? So people
yes, certainly.
Have a good look through?
Yeah. And perhaps people can, in my team, can post some links in the chat so that people can click on and find them straight away. So thanks very much, Andy and Rob. We've got a few questions coming in, and I hope that the people who've asked the questions are ready to launch into their audio zone. I think I'm going to go first with Adrian Coles, if that's okay, team. If you could enable Adrian's audio. Adrian, are you there? Come in, Adrian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, yep. Brilliant. Oh, it worked. Great.
It's like Eurovision, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hi, right, good morning all. It's my first question I put into the chat box was for Andy, and it was all around, you mentioned building resilience in the supply chain. I guess, what are your views in terms of the supply chain possibly altering? And I'm talking about maybe a reshoring and a move away, and this is largely a manufacturing angle, if I'm honest, just because of some of the heavy industry in Wales, and it may be moving from a just-in-time model to a more resilient, maybe hold a little bit more stock, which obviously have impact on working capital, but it would improve the macro environment of Wales and UK.
Well, yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it's not one I necessarily have a clear answer to. I mean, there could potentially be certainly some de-risking aspects here, where the lesson learned, if you like, is that, and actually the lesson learned of the experience of the last couple of years or so, with all of the uncertainty around Brexit, is that companies are having to think carefully about the extent to which they are at risk of just-in-time, very, very low inventory holdings and all the rest of it. I mean, the problem is, of course, it's costly to move away from a model in which you're no longer managing just-in-time, and reshoring obviously has some advantages in terms of local supply chains. Whether we will see that happening in manufacturing, I don't know. And I would say that I think that what will happen between now and the end of this year, between Boris Johnson and the European Union, will have a great deal to play out on this. How firms will react to the pandemic in terms of supply chain resilience, I think is a bit early to tell. But whether they, I mean, if there is ongoing concern for the next 2 to 3 years of sort of second wave or uncertainty until we've finally got a vaccine and that's widely administered, then there are some interesting things to think about whether firms will actually want to be prepared to spend a bit more money, large firms to spend a bit more money to make their supply chains a bit less risky.
Okay, thank you. Another one for you, Andy, if that's okay, from Professor Max Monday.
I can read it on here. Oh, no, right, Max is going to ask it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Max? Yeah, brilliant.
Okay. Thanks for both the presentations. I mean, I guess one of the things of interest is, how far do you think that the outcomes from the longer term outcomes from the pandemic might result in richer areas of Wales becoming richer and poorer areas becoming poorer? Do you think it'll be a force for convergence or divergence in Wales between areas?
I'm afraid I am worried that it's going to be a force for more divergence, and there's two reasons for that. There is a health reason and there's an economic reason, and the emerging evidence is that poorer communities have been hit harder by the pandemic. For a variety of reasons to do with their underlying health, and also if you look at some of the the hotspots like Barrow-in-Furness, which of course is not in Wales, but it could be to do with higher density housing. We've seen this also in some of the valleys areas where there's been higher impact. Having said that, Ceredigion isn't a particularly wealthy place, but adopted a localism strategy over contact tracing at a very early stage, and has managed to avoid the impact of the pandemic on what is a relatively low paid workforce. So, but the consequence of that is that it could then result in further economic divergence, because we will see economic outcomes starting to peel away, and as the economy starts to recover, it could be that recovery is stronger in the both healthier and richer parts of Wales, which is a worry. And therefore, come back to the point that Rob made about shared prosperity and the Regional Investment Fund. I think it becomes crucially important that fund is very well resourced and can start to address some of those things.
Rob, anything to add there? Yeah.
Yeah, if I could, please. Max, I mentioned earlier our repurposing public spaces for economic recovery document, and that sets out the need for thinking about towns right across Wales, so particularly in some of those less well-off areas. And there's a real responsibility for Welsh Government, for local authorities, for businesses themselves, to get involved in discussions on how we do our best, at least, to mitigate some of those risks that Andy's just touched on, and those risks are very real. But there are some things we think that local authorities, Welsh Government, businesses themselves, they can come together and hopefully mitigate some of those risks by being really proactive in how they make themselves attractive to increasing custom within those less well-off areas.
Okay, thank you. I've got an anonymous question here. Let me just find it. So what sort of approaches to skills and training would be the most useful to help small businesses through this crisis? Formal qualifications, more informal approaches? Do you have a feel for the sorts of training that people need? I suppose that's to you, Rob. Yeah. Yeah,
okay. I think two things pop into my mind, or three things mainly. These were points which would have been relevant for businesses a year ago, but again, without wanting to labour the point, everything's a bit more acute right now in terms of need and the importance of these different points. Skills provision needs to be flexible. For small businesses, it needs to be available quickly, and the processes need to be quite simple for businesses to actually access. So I think there would be three key points that I'd highlight there.
Okay, thank you. Can we now go to Professor Catherine Farrell?
Sorry. Okay. So my question really was about the tensions between health and the economy or business. And I wondered, in different parts of the UK, it seems in England, for example, business and the economy is driving this sort of the easing the lockdown. And I think that in other parts of the UK, particularly in Wales, health and safety are more of the concern. So I wondered if there was this tension in your minds as well about health and the economy across the UK.
Certainly a tension in my mind, and the reason there's a tension is because I think it's a completely false trade-off, and it worries me that people are seeing it in this terms of this trade-off. Now, one aspect of this is, well, you know, we are where we are, but I wouldn't have started from here. We know it's increasingly clear that had we locked down earlier, we would have actually done less damage to the business as a result, because we would have come out of the crisis quicker. And that's what we've seen in other countries. The worry is that by giving in too quickly to the, you know, we need to get the shops open, we need to get people out on the streets, we increase the risk of a second wave of the epidemic. And actually that will be even worse for business than being cautious and careful. And I can understand the sort of the kind of really difficult choice that politicians in Wales particularly are facing at the moment, and particularly over the tourism and leisure sector, where clearly that sector wants to get going. Clearly, you know, with the summer now, you know, well underway, and the weather we've been having being very good, they're losing a lot of business. But of course, the minute we relax the five-mile travel restriction, we're going to see, particularly in the part of the Wales where I'm currently, we're going to see large numbers of tourists heading over here, and we're going to then risk the progress that has been made in terms of people's health. So it's a really, really difficult one. But Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman published some research a week or so ago in the American context, in which he said, well, even if you sort of adopt this really dodgy economist's technique of statistically valuing human life, we can debate all morning about whether that's a good idea to do, but even if you do that, there isn't actually a trade-off. Because the damage to the economy from the health consequences of the environment, we're starting to see, you know, that people who've survived it of working age could well still have very long-lasting health implications if they've had a really bad dose of it. But the consequences of that for the human capital of the country is very severe. So there's no real trade-off here for me.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Rob?
Just quickly, if I could come in, I think two points come in. Again, I've talked about guidance and clear guidance, you know, particularly in this instance around PPE, around the use of plastic screens, for example, if we are repurposing public spaces. So, you know, if appropriate measures are put in place, then I think the points that Andy's just made become even more possible. But our default setting is the safety absolutely has to come first. But as Andy's you know, clearly explained there, they're not necessarily, the points are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Okay, thank you. A question to Gwenllian from Ion Leadership. Gwenllian, are you there?
She's up in Bangor. It's a long way away.
Yeah. We found her.
I'm here. I'm actually on the beautiful island of Anglesey.
Oh,
yes,
great.
Good morning, Andy. How are you? All right?
Good morning.
Great webinar. Really enjoyed it this morning. I just wanted to raise, you know, how you mentioned Dylan's Restaurant earlier on as a great example of a company that's attempted to carry on during these unprecedented times. They've worked really closely with organisations such as Menter Môn to deliver food, etc., to key workers and vulnerable people in North Wales. And of course, there have been many other innovative projects that have come about in North Wales during this very, very difficult time. Is there any evidence of statistical differences between North and South Wales of how businesses have coped?
The short answer is no, I don't have any, because we just don't have enough fine-grained data at the moment. All we can really look at is we can try and make inferences from the differences of industrial structure, for example, the high rates of self-employment in rural Wales or in North Wales, and therefore the number and which sectors those businesses are in. So, you know, make some predictions about the likely impact. But at the moment, I haven't seen any evidence in terms of whether North Wales or South Wales businesses are coping better or worse? And that's a really interesting question. Rob, you may have a bit more kind of anecdotal stuff from the FSB. I don't know.
I think actually, Andy, I have to go with what you just said. We're in a similar position. For every story we hear about, which is a good news story in North, we hear about another story which is heartbreaking. And I think the same would be from the South. So it would be really difficult to come up with any trend. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much.
And just a final question to you both. You know, in a nutshell, what do you think's the key thing that Welsh Government needs to focus on now to really help the small business sector?
Okay, shall I go first,
Yeah.
Andy?
Yeah.
Just coming back, actually, to the question that Gwenllian just asked, I would draw a bit of a distinction, actually, between rural areas and town areas. We know that at this point in time, because of travel restrictions and so on, we know that businesses in rural areas are finding it a little more difficult than businesses in towns for various reasons. So I would just throw that into the mix in terms of Gwenllian's question there. Sorry to go back to that. In terms of what government needs to do, clear guidance, support around social distancing, possibly that social distancing grant that we talked about. Looking to relax its borrowing limits where it can. I talked about the Secretary of State and the role that he can play there. In terms of public spaces, Welsh Government can really be proactive in encouraging and enabling local authorities to actually be quite flexible and creative with how public spaces are reused. So planning rules and so on could be looked at, and Welsh Government has got a part to play in enabling local authorities to be able to help small businesses innovate in terms of use of space and use of public spaces particularly. And Welsh Government needs to repurpose that 90 million that I talked about.
Okay, thanks. And Andy, from you, what's your hope as we try and emerge from this crisis?
I agree with a lot of what Rob has said, and I think in medium term, I think we really need to have a really well-designed successor program to structural funds, regional investment funds, shared prosperity. And until we get to that point, I think the Welsh Government needs to continue with the good work that it appears to be doing in terms of supportive grant environment, where it is doing a lot better than England in terms of the data that I presented. I agree with the comments about local councils and spaces and all the rest of it, but I think the broader point there is to say that we need to reverse this trend, which is really stark in a graph I've just seen this morning from the ONS about the way in which central government expenditure has risen dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years, and correspondingly local government spending has fallen. We need to rebalance that. We need to empower local councils and communities because they are closest to the issues, if you like. And I think I'd come back to the Ceredigion example again of I know perhaps it's being overblown, but the fact that a local strategy for contact tracing was effective, or appears to have been effective, suggests that local strategies also to get us out of this crisis will also be effective. So I think Cardiff need to be prepared to trust local authorities that they're the people who know what's best for their local areas and the local businesses.
Okay, well, thank you so much, both Rob and Andy. So I didn't actually mention, Andy, you're a professor of entrepreneurship, aren't you, at Cardiff Business School? And you teach a couple of our professional programme modules. So yeah, if you want to work with Andy, then come and register for some of our programmes here at Cardiff Business School. What we'll do following this session is we'll send out the links that Rob mentioned to the FSB reports, and we'll also, I think there's a questionnaire. Rob, did you want to mention that?
Yeah, just a very quick questionnaire that we'd like to circulate to attendees if we can. It just helps us try and shape events that we put on with partners to best meet the needs of those attending. So if you do have, it'll take literally a minute to fill in the questionnaire. So if you can, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thanks ever so much for joining us, everyone, and see you at our next event with Sophie Howe and Dr. Jane Lynch. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye, everyone.